Assalamualaikum. Hi, Michael. Good morning. Great to see you.
Good afternoon to you. Good to see you.
Yes, good afternoon. It's really early, and salute to you for getting up so early. And I'm usually dazed at this time of the. Of
With small kids, I think that the day always starts very early. It's all
yeah.
good. This is fine. Looking forward to it.
So am I, and I'm sure so are many people who have joined the call. This is such a relevant topic, and you're an expert and perhaps now one of the most well-known faces in the US related to Pakistan. And so I'm really delighted to have you on this. And the key question is that, as you know, Pakistan is facing default. And over the last 12 months, there was very high expectation within Pakistan. And I know you have been, calling it out, saying that it's, things are not that rosy. But at least in Pakistan, whenever I spoke with both investors as well as the government, there was a hope that the US will come and bail Pakistan out. Because it has happened so many times in the past. I remember a few months back, there were headlines in Pakistani newspapers that the US ambassador will help Pakistan with IMF. I think even our prime minister requested or indicated that he would seek US help with IMF and to get some kind of waivers which would unlock the remaining part of IMF's fund program for Pakistan. But that doesn't seem to have happened. In my last meeting with the Ministry of Finance, the Minister of Finance actually, he asked many times that why hasn't the US supported Pakistan, and he kind of implied that he felt that it's because of China. So those are the big two questions which I wanted to ask you, and why hasn't the US helped, or was it even ever fair to expect the US to help in a way with IMF? Has it happened in the past? And if it hasn't happened this time so far, is it related to China, or is it related to something in the US? Or can things change? And then after that, I would love to ask you some follow-up questions related to that. But that's the big question, so over to you.
Yeah, thanks. And again, thanks for having me. So in terms of why the U.S. has not helped bail Pakistan out, why has it not done more on that front? I think that we have to see this in the broader context of how the international community more widely is approaching the issue of Pakistan's economic crisis. I think it's quite notable to me that Pakistan's top creditors, its top bilateral donors, setting aside the U.S., but China, the Gulf countries, have been very hands-off, or should I say, more hands-off than they've typically been in the past. I think that it seems quite apparent that no one wants to be particularly quick to come to Pakistan's rescue. And indeed, that is a bit different from how things have been in the past, where I think that there tended to be this view that, not to use a cliche, but Pakistan was too big to fail, that its friends and partners couldn't afford to let it collapse economically. Hence, these release of funds and working to get the IMF to move quickly. And indeed, the IMF itself has been moving very, very slowly. But I think that there's a variety of factors at play when it comes to the United States. First, we need to keep the broader political aspects of the relationship in mind. The U.S. government has wanted to be very cautious about how it goes about its relationship with Pakistan over the last year. The U.S. government perception is that it was dragged into Pakistan's domestic politics when Imran Khan accused the U.S. of being behind his ouster. And ever since then, the administration has wanted to be very cautious and very careful. And I think that it doesn't want to do anything that could be perceived in Pakistan as taking a side, so to speak, and in this case, taking the side of the PDM government. But looking at this even a bit more broadly, I think that there's a sense in Washington and many other capitals that Pakistan is in a very unsettled state right now for reasons that we can all imagine. And the idea of moving quickly to try to bail out Pakistan, it may not make much sense given that the current government, its political survival is in question. There's supposed to be an election in a few months. We don't really know if that's going to happen. We don't know if it'll happen on time, so on and so forth. So there's that as well. But what was the final point I was going to make? And the China factor. I I wouldn't agree with that perception that the U.S. is holding back because it simply assumes that that China is in the game, so to speak. I would argue, and I've heard from U.S. officials say directly, that the U.S. is keen to ensure that it has enough of a relationship with Pakistan, a commercial relationship, a relationship more broadly, so that Pakistan is not fully reliant on Chinese economic largesse. And that would suggest that the U.S. should be doing more to try to help right the economic ship. But that has to be balanced out with the other considerations that I put in place. Yeah, I think that the U.S., like other key Pakistani economic partners and the IMF on the whole, don't simply want to throw money at Pakistan without having full assurances that Pakistan is going to implement the austerity measures and other policies that the IMF would insist need to be put out there because of the track record of Pakistan taking on so much money from the IMF only to renege on those commitments down the road.
Absolutely. So how do you think it plays out from here? Like, does it play? Does the US and other donors do they think that they will allow Pakistan to default on the sovereign commitments, and they think that's a viable path, and that will not jeopardize or impact their relationships, or so it will be business as usual afterwards? Or do you think that at some point somebody will step in and try to support? Like, how does it play out from?
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to say. I do think, going back to what I said before, with the very unsettled political situation in Pakistan, I think no one country, even Pakistan's closest partners, are in any rush to try to help Pakistan. Quite frankly, so the IMF schedule, the current EFF, the current agreement with the IMF expires in just a few weeks. It expires in June, and that suggests that even if something really spectacular and surprising were to happen, and there is an agreement on unlocking this $1.1 billion left in the current agreement, well, Pakistan is going to be back at square one no matter what in just a matter of weeks, which I think raises the possibility that even if there were to be some type of miracle deal, Pakistan gets that money unlocked, negotiations would have to start again, because obviously $1.1 billion is not going to rescue Pakistan's economy. It may give it some breathing room, but it's not going to end its economic crisis altogether. And so the country would be back at square one. And my sense, based on some conversations I've had with insiders that know how the IMF thinks on these deals, the IMF negotiators do not want to be in a position where they actually do make a deal with Pakistan, money comes through, only for there to be a situation where, despite some money being unlocked, Pakistan then goes ahead and defaults some weeks or some months later, and the IMF does not want to be in that position, just for a variety of reasons. So yeah, it's very hard to see where things are going. My bottom line is that no one is going to jump in anytime soon to help Pakistan, and especially given the current political state of play. Perhaps when there's more, maybe when there's a clear sense of the electoral calendar, if there's a clear sense that the national elections will indeed be held in October, when they're scheduled to take place, that I think could be a boost. Certainly that would, I think, impact foreign investors' perceptions of Pakistan. I think that it would bring a measure of relief to the IMF and other federal creditors. But I just don't think that Pakistan will be able to look for help from its closest partners as it had in the past. Going back to China just for a second, I'm sure you recall this. The Chinese foreign minister was in Islamabad a few weeks ago, and in a very rare, something very unusual happened, where in public remarks, he essentially called on Pakistan to restore political stability, suggesting that Beijing was getting really concerned about what's going on the ground in Pakistan. That public comment, that public plea for stability to be restored, happened just a few days before Imran Khan was arrested, and obviously things got even more unstable in Pakistan. So that suggests a degree of frustration within Beijing. And at the end of the day, I think that China is Pakistan's most trusted ally, the one it historically, traditionally can go to. And to see what happened with that sequencing of the Chinese foreign minister making that very unusual public plea for stability, and then to see things go in the complete opposite direction, it seems that those in charge in Pakistan are not willing to heed the pleas of even their closest allies even recognizing, acknowledging that had Pakistan been willing to heed that plea from China, that might have increased the likelihood that Beijing would be more willing to provide some even immediate term economic assistance.
That's very interesting. I think I totally agree with you, and I think, as you rightly pointed out, it seems that political stability is the precondition for any other conversation on matters of economy, but I think generally on all kinds of matters, for the reasons we all know. But I'm surprised that I think you're essentially saying that you think that because I thought that perhaps the action on Imran Khan post the comments from the Chinese might be because of the comments of Chinese, because you're essentially saying that if the government goes and gives a date for election, and if there is clarity on a date for elections, then that's a more positive indicator than delaying the elections.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, again, there's so many factors at play here, and I don't want to overstate one factor over the other, but I do think that the electoral calendar is a very significant issue. Also, keeping in mind, for the IMF, what they're looking for is that Pakistan's top creditors will be willing to step in to provide assistance once there's a deal, once there's an agreement to unlock funds. But the likes of China, I don't see them being willing to to step in line and be ready to release funds. If they see that those in power don't seem to care about what their concerns are about stability, and if there's so much uncertainty about the immediate political future of the country, the next few weeks, the next few months.
So certainly, stability, it makes sense that stability is a precondition. I have a follow-up question on this. Do you think that China, Saudi Arabia, US, the countries who we expect to come in to bail out Pakistan, do they have a political preference on who should be the leader in Pakistan? Or if I put it another way, do you think that if Imran Khan wins and their election, then he comes back, do you think that these countries will still be interested in supporting Pakistan?
Well, yeah, I could start with the U.S. because that's the one that I'd be most familiar with, sitting here in Washington. I mean, indeed, as you know, the official position in Washington is the U.S. doesn't have any favorites, and that's been stated repeatedly because it has to be, quite frankly. Given the history, recent history of what Khan had done, and the allegation he made against the administration, I think that would make it difficult for the administration and certainly the White House to be ready to start working with an Imran Khan government in Pakistan. That's to overstate this point, but this is very important, that for many in Washington, the main concern about those allegations that Khan had made against the administration was not that he made allegations that were not true, but the fact that he put in danger the life of a senior U.S. official, because he had named this official and accused him of being behind this effort to oust him. And people have not forgotten about that in the White House, and they're not going to forget about it for a while. Obviously, Khan and his people know this because they've been waging an effort through the assistance of a lobby group here in Washington to try to patch up ties with the Biden administration. They've been working on Capitol Hill, particularly working through the Pakistani American community, which is very sympathetic to Imran Khan. So that would be tough. But my sense is that if the political situation calmed down, and this is a big if Khan were to return to power, which I also think is a big if, then I imagine that grudgingly the administration would certainly be willing to partner with Pakistan. I mean, we've heard enough messaging from the State Department, and it's the State Department that I think has the lead in U.S. policy toward Pakistan now, that there is a genuine commitment to pivot away from how the relationship used to be during the war in Afghanistan and so on, and focus on trying to build up better commercial relations, economic relations, trade relations. That's a genuine hope of the State Department. The U.S. ambassador in Islamabad has emphasized that that's a priority for him, to scale up trade relations. And I really don't think that would be impacted if Khan comes back to government. I think comes back to power. Again, I think it would be more the White House, which would be a bit hesitant. I mean, even now, quite frankly, even with this poly crisis playing out in Pakistan, The White House is not particularly focused on Pakistan, to be very frank. Very briefly, in terms of the other countries, Pakistan's other partners, if they have a preference, I don't think so. There is certainly a view among many analysts that the Chinese were not happy with the Khan government early in its term when it was questioning CPEC. When it was at one point, you even had a call to suspend CPEC in order to get a better sense of what was going on. Corruptions about opacity and possible corruption. Khan people say no, that wasn't the case at all. But I do think there is a certain comfort level within Beijing with many of those leaders that are in power now, notwithstanding concern about what's happening on the ground with this PDM government. But based in the past, that the Nawaz Sharif, the Sharif family had worked very closely with China on CPEC and so on. And I think the same might go for the Gulf allies, the Gulf countries, where of course, the Sharif family, for one, has a very deep ties there. So that could count for something. But I really think that in all these cases, these countries have their own reasons for wanting to maintain partnership with Pakistan that would transcend considerations about who's in power. So again, I think the main issue is political stability. If the political situation improves, if finally the country is able to move on from what it's dealing with now, then I think that its closest partners would come back and be willing to work with it, regardless of who is in government. Now, whole separate issue, if the military were to take over down the road, if the military were to come back, would that have an impact on the relationship? I don't think so. I think, quite frankly, that these countries, other than the U.S., Pakistan's main partners are not democracies, and I don't necessarily think they would care if the military is in power. They may even prefer that. But that's another interesting angle to consider.
What about the US? Do you think they will treat it like Egypt, or will they not engage with a military government?
Yeah, I mean, this has been a point of debate among analysts here in Washington. Certainly, the past track record of the U.S. suggests that it's perfectly comfortable working with the generals, and it's had very good relations with all of Pakistan's military leaders over time. But at the same time, there is this policy, and it's contradictory, of supporting civilian institutions and civilian democracy. And the Kerry Lugar-Berman bill, even though it became tainted on many levels from Pakistan's perception, was meant to do just that, to strengthen civilian democracy. I imagine that some in Washington might quietly be willing to tolerate and even support the return of the military, assuming that the view there would be that it could restore a semblance of stability. But I think that the more knowledgeable observers and policymakers here in Washington would view that as very concerning, just because the military is in a very different state from how it had been in previous years, previous decades when it seized power. It's no longer that sacrosanct institution. It's on the defensive. It's suffered major hits to its popularity. And that means that the return of the military through a coup would not necessarily be a stabilizing factor. It would perhaps be a destabilizing one. So I think that officially, the official line, if there were to be a return of the army, the return of the military in Pakistan, is that the U.S. government would likely issue statements condemning it, but quietly would probably, when it would have to, it would work with the military, just as it has, even when the military has not been in direct power. It's sort of the joke in Washington that there's never been a senior U.S. official that knows who the defense minister is in Pakistan, just because there's always a preference to go to the army chief when you really need to get something done, which is, I think, unfortunate. But that has been a de facto policy for the U.S. in recent years.
What about the strength of the relationship between current army chief in Pakistan and the US? Because in the past, we have heard that General Musharraf, it's in the press that his first call was to General Zinni in the US because they were friends. We heard General Kiani had friendships with the US generals, and similarly, General Bajwa also had personal friendships with the US general. A, what's the source of these relationships? B, do you think General the current army chief also has similar relationships in the US? And second, lastly, how does these military to military relationship translate into political support? Because as you said, that you think that it's the State Department who deals with Pakistan. So in the US, does the Pentagon also have influence on policy?
Yeah, so I think it's a great question about General Munir, in that he's cut from a different mold, so to speak. He's very different from his predecessors in that he doesn't have links, he doesn't have close links to the West. He doesn't have the experience of being trained at Sandhurst or any of the U.S. Military academies. So he's not very Westernized at all. Whereas one could argue that the likes of Bajwa and Musharraf and even Kiani and others before him, or definitely others before them, did have, connections to the West, either through their own time spent at U.S. military academies or training centers, experiences of their family members. It seems like so many previous army chiefs had relatives in the United States, as General Bajwa does, for example. And it's different with General Munir, and I think that suggests that it would not necessarily be as easy for him to have a camaraderie with the United States and with Western officials. My understanding is that he has indeed had engagements with the U.S. ambassador in Pakistan, I believe, but I don't have a sense as to what the comfort level is with him and U.S. officials. I'm not aware of him meeting any U.S. officials based in Washington, and certainly, so far as I know, now he's only been in his post for a few months, but I certainly don't think that he's been to the United States during that time. So, but no, if you look at the history of the relationship, it's interesting, the U.S.-Pakistan relationship, even when when there have been severe tensions in the relationship, including because of policies of one side's military, the military to military relationship has remained quite cordial on officer to officer levels. And that's for the reason that I mentioned before, just because of this deep experience of Pakistani military officers, including some very senior ones, spending time in the United States at training centers and so on. And until, though this doesn't happen anymore, you would also have U.S. military officers spending time at training academies in Pakistan, particularly the one in Quetta. That doesn't happen as much anymore. And just seeing this anecdotally as someone who's been involved in track twos over the years, there certainly is a sense of camaraderie and comfort level on people to people levels between military officers from both countries. And I have no reason to think that that has not been sustained even now, with the relationship in a bit of flux, and the U.S. being very cautious in terms of how it engages officially with Pakistan. So I think that the military to military relationship remains quite strong. One more point on that: there's this thing called IMET, which is basically the preeminent U.S. Education and training program for foreign military officers. President Trump suspended that program when he suspended security aid to Pakistan on the whole. But a few years later, it was quietly reinstituted, because I think of a recognition of how important that program is and what it means for military to military relations. So that suggests to me that no matter what happens with General Munir and his relationship with the United States, whatever it might be, that there's still going to be good relations between the two militaries, particularly so long as those exchanges, those training and education programs remain in place.
And how does the military relationship affect U.S. policy? And then are the generals also involved in policy making in the U.S.?
No, I mean, well, I think that maybe yes, to an extent, when the U.S. was fighting in Afghanistan, and there was more reason to be working very closely, including at times on operational levels with the Pakistanis, after the 9/11 attacks, when the U.S. and Pakistan actually had some pretty significant achievements in counterterrorism cooperation, going after Al-Qaeda, before the relationship took a turn for the worse. I think at that point you would have had much more, the Pentagon and certainly the CIA and the intel agencies would have been playing much more of a role in impacting, if not driving, policy. But I think now, things are different, just because the relationship has been winnowed down. There isn't really much to security cooperation on operational levels. There was a counterterrorism dialogue recently, but there wasn't, so far as I know, there wasn't much substantive that was discussed about it. And so with the State Department driving the relationship, the White House seems perfectly happy with that. I don't think there's any complaints from the Pentagon, which is focused on other matters. So that that suggests that no, you're not seeing the Pentagon drive the relationship. But certainly, even back during that period of the war in Afghanistan, especially the first 2 years when the U.S. and Pakistan were working closely together, the U.S. is different from Pakistan in the sense that you're not going to have the the Pentagon making the final say on policy. The White House was certainly still driving the policy on a formal level, and having veto power and so on and so forth.
Thank you so much for that insight. It's very interesting for somebody sitting in Pakistan, where we expect, we are used to like generals calling and affecting policy. I want to ask you about China and Saudi Iran, China-Saudi relationship, and especially broking the deal with Iran. It was in the press that the US said that they didn't see that coming. Are you tracking that, and how does that impact Pakistan, especially vis-a-vis US-Pakistan relationship?
Yeah, I mean, I can't say, can't speak to those rumors that the U.S. didn't see it coming and so on. But in terms of what it means, I think it's obviously a milestone development for international relations, and it suggests that China is really making a big push to scale up its influence in the Middle East, and not just through BRI, not just through infrastructure investments, but through being a key diplomatic power broker. And certainly, given the nature of U.S.-China competition, that's going to be seen as a net bad thing, so to speak. And in terms of what it means for Pakistan, I think that the most obvious implication is that if that deal between the Saudis and Iranians holds, that could give Pakistan more diplomatic space to engage more with Iran. And I think that we've seen a desire on the part of Islamabad to scale up ties, particularly commercial ties, energy ties with Iran, but a sense that they've held back from really putting the pedal to the metal, so to speak, because of the nature of Pakistan's very important relationship with Saudi Arabia. But if the Saudi-Iranian reconciliation holds, I think that the implication for Pakistan would be that it could try to do more with Iran without worrying about how Saudi Arabia could respond. But a lot of big ifs. I mean, we don't know if that deal is going to hold. I'm not an expert on Middle East geopolitics, so I'm not the person to weigh in on that. But we have to see how that deal holds. But bringing this back to the United States, I think it's quite notable that not too long after that China-mediated deal took place, you have this big meeting in Riyadh between the U.S. NSA and the NSAs from a number of other countries, Saudi Arabia, also India, and the UAE, to talk about the idea of this new transconnectivity project that links the Middle East to India via a series of new ports and railroads and so on. And the implication would be that Israel would be a part of this as well, especially if there's a peace deal between the Saudis and the Israelis. So that, to me, suggests that the U.S. is trying to think of how to ensure that its own influence and footprint remains deep in the Middle East, even with China entering the fray in a big way. Certainly, U.S. policy in the Middle East has changed a lot. It's not fighting wars there like it used to be. It's not as reliant on energy in the Middle East. So that means that its interests there have changed. But it certainly is still, it wants to be in the game, so to speak. And certainly with China making its own efforts to build out its presence. So it's certainly something to watch, how U.S.-China competition plays out in the Middle East. And certainly with Pakistan, not impacted by that because of its very close relations with so many of the key players in that region, the Saudis, and of course the other Arab Gulf countries, and potentially Iran as well. I think that this all has implications for Pakistan too.
Thank you. I'm really enjoying the conversation with you as always. But we'll open up for questions from the audience. But before that, I'll just pitch in two more quick questions. And I know I'm going over the time for my questions from the audience. So first is, we have seen on Twitter this Khalid write quite supportive messages for Imran Khan. Does that reflect any US policy, or do you think that's purely personal comments? But is it like common for a US diplomat to give personal comments about some other country? Like, is there something more to that than what we can just read?
Yeah, right. I know a number of people have taken note of this. It certainly does not represent U.S. policy because he doesn't work for the Trump. Pardon me. He doesn't work for the current administration. He worked for the Trump administration, not Biden. He's a private citizen now. So no, it doesn't at all represent U.S. policy, and certainly because the U.S. certainly wouldn't does not want to take sides, and Khalilzad is very much taking Imran Khan's side, 200%. So it's not U.S. policy. I'm not sure, quite frankly, why he suddenly is so focused on domestic politics in Pakistan. Some people have told me that he's just is very interested in what's going on in Pakistan now, which is notable, but still wouldn't necessarily, I think, explain why he's suddenly become so focused on it. But to be honest, I don't know. It's interesting that if several very prominent former U.S. officials have been weighing in very heavily on the domestic political crisis in Pakistan. Another one is John Bolton. Again, someone that had served in a previous administration. Of course, Bolton served in both Trump and George W. Bush administrations. He's come out and condemned the crackdown on Khan and all. Very interesting. But again, this does not represent U.S. policy.
Right. And the last question, we have spoken a lot about the scenario that they are the good scenario that after there's political stability, then something can happen. But what if there is no political stability, and what if Pakistan defaults on the sovereign commitments? What happens then? How do you gameplay that in terms of the scenario playing out? Does that mean that post that Pakistan's access to international markets will be shut, and that would make Pakistan more reliant on bilateral funding from friendly countries? So will that push Pakistan more into the China bloc because everything else would be blocked for it, and hence it will go deeper in that camp, and or there's some other scenario? And how do you see that playing out?
Yeah, it's tough to say. Indeed, I've been trying to gameplay this for some weeks, and I think that the immediate concern, if Pakistan defaults, would obviously be the economic collapse, but also internal stability. Because if there's a default, that could suggest that you could have outright scarcities in key commodities, where the country, much like Sri Lanka, when it defaulted, it ran out of fuel altogether, and the implications that could have for the potential that could have for unrest and violence, it's all very scary and very troubling. And so perhaps in that context, where Pakistan's key partners see the country on the whole in very much in peril, not the country on the whole, but this idea that you could have sustained social breakdowns, unrest, economic collapse, maybe that would prompt someone to step in. I mean, it's a bit different now. We had discussed earlier that no friend of Pakistan's has been rushing to support it. But as tumultuous and volatile as things are now, I mean, you don't at this point in time have manifestations of sustained social unrest and so on. But that could happen down the road. So yeah, that might make the likes of China or even one of the Gulf countries step in. I mean, we have seen, for example, the UAE. Correct me if I'm wrong if it's not the UAE, but the UAE has actually been willing to step in. They made a pledge of, I think, a few $1 billion just a few months ago. So maybe they would step in. The United States claims that its main interest in Pakistan is stability, and if the country is collapsing economically and you've got violent protests everywhere, then presumably, if that's true, then U.S. interests would be imperiled. Would that prompt the United States to step in with support? But again, going back to the core issue of the political situation, my sense is that at this point in time, Pakistan's close partners are very uncomfortable with the idea of putting money in the hands of this government that's in power now, and so that could backfire if the country is literally falling apart. But the PDM is still in power with the army sort of hanging around there. Would these countries want to put money in the hands of the government that, in the view of many of these allies and partners, is very much responsible for what's going on to start with? That's sort of a tough question, but that's something to consider.
And that's very interesting, because I actually had not thought about it like that, that actually the current government is not getting any money from anybody. So because we were all thinking about what will happen after the elections, and if Khan comes, then what is his whether people will like him or not. But what we know for a fact is that a current setup, which has proven to be unpopular or has not been able to produce political stability, is not getting the required results which were expected from the government, or which are expected from any government. We are open for questions, so please, if you have questions for Michael, please write it down on chat and I'll read it to him. And in the meanwhile, while people write the questions, I'll probably ask more questions. How important is Pakistan for you, for the US, or is it even important? Because of course we know that during Afghan war it was important, and perhaps now it's not important. But is it like completely not important, or is it somewhat important? Like, is it too big to fail? Coming back to that question, that is it important enough for the US, and how much mind space does it get in the US?
So you mean within the US government?
Yes, in terms of the attention from the government thinking about supporting Pakistan.
Yeah, it doesn't really get much mind space, quite frankly. And as I had said before, I emphasized that the mind space it gets in terms of policy space is mainly from the State Department. To be very honest, even USAID, which of course has a very long relationship with Pakistan and these programs in Pakistan for many years, my understanding is that USAID is still trying to figure out what its plan in Pakistan should be, but it hasn't really been a priority. So that really means it's just the State Department. So certainly, the offices, at the Bureau of South and Central Asian Affairs, very focused on Pakistan for sure, but beyond that, there's just not much to it. Keeping in mind the broader picture in Washington right now, both in terms of how it's looking at foreign policy and how it's looking at things at home. The war in Ukraine obviously is dominating everything. But then beyond that, the competition with China is so critical and is, again, dominating everything, bipartisan concern. And then, looking at domestic issues, we have an election here. It's hard to believe it's coming already. We have an election next year in just over a year. So I think that that's going to mean that the mind space for Pakistan recedes even more. President Biden, because of his past as a senator, obviously very focused on what's happening on Capitol Hill. Right now the issue of the hour is the risk of a default, and we're talking about defaults in Pakistan. He's very focused on that. He canceled this really important visit to Australia in order to focus on that. There's always things going on Capitol Hill. So I think the bottom line is Pakistan certainly is not a top 10 priority, probably not even a top 20 priority for the administration here. It is still important in a strategic sense, as perceived by folks here, for the reasons that it's always been considered important. And it's even to the point of cliche, repeating it, its location, its size, the large population, the youth bulge, the history of terrorism and violent extremism, the presence of nuclear weapons, that combination. And certainly its relationships with China, with the Saudis, with the Gulf states. These are really critical players as seen by the US. So that means that it'll certainly continue to be seen as important. But ever since the US left Afghanistan, given that for such a long time, US officials looked at the relationship with Pakistan through the lens of Afghanistan and the war there, with the US out of the picture, with the US out of the picture, I think it makes Pakistan less important. And to the extent that the US is still looking at Afghanistan, it's through the issue of humanitarian assistance, trying to get the Taliban to change their policies on women's rights and all. But the US doesn't need Pakistan to help in that regard. It doesn't need Pakistan as a mediator. Given the Pakistanis' relationship with the Taliban, the US has its own channels with the Taliban. It already engages with the Taliban, even though it hasn't formally recognized the Taliban. And the US has designated Qatar as the country that represents US interests in Afghanistan, not Pakistan. So I think that also shows that, the strategic importance of Pakistan as perceived by Washington has not been eliminated, has not disappeared, but it certainly has receded over the last few years.
Very, very interesting. And thank you for that point about Qatar, that in terms of even engagement with Afghanistan, it's now being done by another country, not by Pakistan. Mm-hmm. So the first question, I'll just read it to you. What are the commercial interests that the US would have with Pakistan? Or it just keeps, or is it mainly because of the China angle? How do you see US ability to sanction Pak-Iran trade, Pak-Russia trade?
So the latter part of the question, I'll take that first. I guess the reference is to the decision of Pakistan to import its initial shipment of oil from Russia. Nothing is going to come of that. We've heard in public messaging from Pakistani officials, and quite frankly, I've heard in private messaging from Pakistani officials as well that that the U.S. may not have given its approval, so to speak, but there was consultation between Pakistani and American officials on how that deal would be done before it was concluded. And given that we're just talking about, at this point at least, one shipment, I don't think this is something that's going to bother the United States. And I think that given how keen Islamabad is to maintain a good relationship with the U.S., it wants U.S. economic support. I don't think that the PDM government would have done anything that could have antagonized Washington. So I think it only went through with this deal when it had received assurances that everything would be okay. Now, to the other aspects of the question, so there's not going to be any sanctioning or anything like that. In terms of how the U.S. sees its commercial interest in Pakistan, no, I have to emphasize something I said at the beginning. I would argue that Washington views trade. It wants trade to become the next big anchor for the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. It wants trade to drive the relationship. And of course, we've already seen the significant increases in trade volume in recent years. The U.S. ambassador was even willing to risk upsetting India by going to Muzaffarabad a few months ago to make a big speech there about how he values trade with Pakistan. But so long as the current situation is what it is, the economic crisis, the political uncertainty, I think it's going to be difficult to see any forward movement on that. The U.S., and again, I emphasize the State Department, with perhaps some assist from Commerce and the Treasury and others, would like to move forward and build on what the likes of the U.S.-Pakistan Business Council have done over the years and try to push for more trade in a variety of areas. But it's just not something that can happen from a U.S. perspective so long as this policy crisis is playing out.
There was another part of the question which was about Iran. So we have heard some news about the pipeline as well.
Mm-hmm.
Will that also get a green signal from the US?
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't think that Pakistan would be willing to move forward on any type of new commercial arrangement with Iran unless it's gotten some sense of assurances from Washington. Now, unlike the situation with the oil deal with Russia, I have not heard any messaging from either side about how there was some type of assurances provided. But I think that Pakistan has to be very careful. I mean, I imagine that the reason why there has been some forward movement, with these, like this new border market deal that was concluded, a new agreement on electricity sharing between Pakistan and Iran. I imagine the main trigger for those things was the deal, the Saudi Arabia-Iran deal, quite frankly. But again, I don't know. I can't say for sure, but I just would think that the Pakistanis would have had to get some assurances that the U.S. wouldn't be bothered by that and there wouldn't be a sanctions risk, because the last thing Pakistan could afford now is to be sanctioned by the United States.
No, absolutely. I'm curious to understand that, when we read comments like Pakistan has requested the US ambassador to help with IMF, how does that work? Like, does the ambassador then call the State Department and ask them to ask the US representative on IMF's board to then do something? And then how does that chain of communication work generally?
Well, I think it depends on the personalities involved and the administration in place. I don't think there's any one way that it's usually done, but indeed, yes. I mean, typically it would start, if this is something that the U.S. ambassador would want to pursue, the U.S. ambassador would make the decision as to which interlocutor to go to, probably working through, colleagues, in Washington at the State Department. And then they figure out, how to get to the people that in Washington that serve as representatives, so to speak, vis-a-vis the IMF. But again, it's not something I'd want to generalize about, just because bureaucracies are bureaucracies. They're consistent, but there could be different ways of going about this, and it also depends on the level of urgency, right? I mean, if there's a case where the U.S. concludes that absolutely this is the moment when you have to, there needs to be a push to get the IMF to move forward, then obviously certain levels of bureaucracy could be overlooked. But I don't know how, in this particular case, as we were discussing before, I'm not sure that the U.S. feels an incredibly strong sense of urgency to try to push the IMF to move things forward. Certainly, I think that the U.S. government wants to see Pakistan's economy stabilize for sure, but as I had said before, I think it wants assurances, like so many other of Pakistan's friends do, that Pakistan is going to be willing to take the steps that the IMF mandates it takes. But anyway, so the answer to your question is I don't have a good answer. It really depends on the people involved, the administration involved.
Thank you. And I know you mentioned that you don't look at, and your primary focus is not Middle East, but just vis-a-vis Pakistan. I'm curious to understand that in terms of, like, there was one school of thought which has always said that Saudi is close to the US, and Saudi has deeper relationship in Pakistan and greater influence on Pakistan. So US and Saudi are typically on one side when they are talking to Pakistan. And that was a sense we always had. Do you think that's still the case, or has the link between US and Saudi become weaker?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, there was a point when you had this crisis in relations between the U.S. and the Saudis. After what happened a few years ago with, feel bad, I'm blanking on the name, the journalist that was killed in that horrific fashion. Yeah, Khashoggi, yeah. But we've seen a reconciliation in the Biden era, and likewise with Pakistan, you had some tensions between the Pakistanis and the Saudis during the Khan government, when Pakistan thought that Saudi Arabia was not taking a strong enough position on the Kashmir issue. Well, that's changed. So they seem to be back to being in a good place with their relationship. But yeah, I think that the U.S. and the Saudis do see the situation in Pakistan on similar levels. I think you could argue some exceptions. I think that certainly in the State Department, historically there's been concerns expressed about freedom of speech issues, crackdowns on rights, and issues with minority rights. The Saudis, I think, don't really bring attention to that, don't really care about those types of things, quite frankly. But on the broader contours of the relationship right now, I think that the U.S. and the Saudis feel similarly. They want to see stability restored. They'd like to see economic stability restored, but neither is willing to put themselves out there to offer up a lot of assistance anytime soon. So on that level, I would think, not to generalize too much, that generally speaking, though, Washington and Riyadh are sort of see Pakistan eye to eye. They really see Pakistan through a similar lens at this point.
Got it. Moving to the question from the group here, they're interested in knowing your views on this notion of yuan-based trade between Saudi Arabia and China, and potentially Pakistan and China. Is there any US sensitivity on that? Again, this is a topic of a lot of conspiracy theories that this is a red line for the US.
Right, and I can't respond to whether the U.S. would think it's a red line. I doubt it would, but certainly in this era of very intense U.S.-China competition, I'm sure that Washington wouldn't be happy with that. Though I would think as well that Washington would recognize, or would want to recognize, that given Pakistan's economic stress, the severity of its economic stress, Pakistan is going to want to take certain steps that would benefit economically. As I said before, Islamabad will be careful. It wouldn't want to do anything unless it has assurances from the U.S. that it wouldn't face sanctions or ire, or whatever the case may be. But I don't really have a sense as to how specifically the U.S. government has responded to this issue and Pakistan's potential role in it. But I think that I'd like to think that in the White House and the administration here, there would be a willingness to understand that there's a need to strike a balance between, pushing countries not to do anything that would go against U.S. interests, whether it's trading with Russia or China or whatever the case, and also seeing the need for countries like Pakistan to take steps for purely economic reasons that are essential at this moment, even if it may be something that the US would not want to see. Now, certainly the US has a lot of patience for what India is doing in that regard. And obviously, the relationship between the US and India is very different from the US Pakistan relationship. But I like to think that the US would recognize that, even the likes of Pakistan, it's important that the U.S. recognize that Pakistan is governed on many levels by its immediate economic needs, even if what it wants to do might go against what the U.S. would like to see it do for the sake of America's own interests.
Going to a question from Omer, and he's asking that, that don't you think that IMF's role is also questionable, that IMF is supposed to be the lender of last resort for developing countries, but it's asking Pakistan to arrange external financing from other bilateral sources before it moves forward. What is the point of having an IMF program with such stringent condition if it can't be the lender of last resort?
Yeah, that's a fair point. That's a fair critique of the IMF, but obviously, the IMF it sets its own rules for releasing funding, and I think that it's only fair that if you're a country and you want to if you want to pursue an agreement with the IMF to receive funding, you got to do what the what the institute stipulates that you do to get the money and to maintain the funds. But yeah, I think that one could certainly acknowledge these broader critiques about the IMF and other IFIs as well, particularly at a moment in time when there's increasing debate about whether we're moving toward or should be moving toward a post-Bretton Woods era where the IMF and the World Bank and other IFIs no longer dominate international financial regimes, for reasons including the one that was mentioned in the question. That's a fair debate, but bottom line is if Pakistan wants financial assistance from the IMF, it has to meet the conditions of the IMF. And I think the IMF has good reason to be concerned that given Pakistan's track record with taking funds and not honoring the conditions, that maybe it's time to take a tougher line.
Certainly, but again, the thing which I don't fully understand is that I can totally appreciate if there's a commercial lender and the lender says that I have to evaluate this case on merits of its case and it doesn't meet the merits, which then it's okay. But I don't know how much is IMF, how much of IMF is a commercial organization or a normal organization, and how much of it is a political organization, because we keep on hearing about the demands for getting, the request for getting the US to call IMF and do favors. So is it a political entity or is it a commercial entity? That's the part which I think most people are confused on.
Yeah, well, I think that an organization as huge and consequential and wealthy as the IMF, obviously there has to be politics at play. I'm not an IMF insider, so I certainly can't weigh in on that conclusively. But I think if you were to look at this in a broader spectrum, in the U.S., in the Pakistan context, FATF is an institution that comes up a lot in the context of, oh, that's a very politically driven organization, and I think that there's a need oftentimes to push back against this idea that these very influential institutions are so impacted by politics. But now politics plays out everywhere in international relations, and if you look back a few years at the IMF and how the U.S. has tried to push it, going back to the Trump administration, there had been a time when the U.S. government was trying to ensure that any funding that the IMF provides to Pakistan would not be used to, finance Chinese loans or in any way that could assist China. That I think that certainly is political to an extent. Now, I don't think that that's happening now with the Biden administration, but you see how certain countries try to use certain institutions to help pursue their own interests. That may not be politics, maybe it's geopolitics, but that certainly is a reality that one should not overlook. But at the same time, these are very technical institutions as well, organizations as well, including FATF. So I wouldn't want to overstate the nature of politicization, but absolutely, politics certainly plays out everywhere.
Thank you. And last week I did a webinar with the Pakistani journalist, and he said that the US demanded some kind of restrictions on Pakistan's long-range missile program in return for support for IMF. So his view was that it wasn't about political stability. It was more about that demand for on the missiles. Have you heard anything related to that? It was in the press in Pakistan as well.
Yeah, well, right. I mean, yes, I vaguely remember hearing about that. To me, that seems extremely unlikely. I think it sounds just like another conspiracy theory to me. I mean, I understand there's a tendency to assume the worst about U.S. Policy intentions vis-a-vis Pakistan, but the IMF would not. That has no relevance to the IMF. The IMF doesn't condition anything on considerations about weapons or anything like that. It's so I'm quite confident that's simply an urban legend, something that's not accurate.
Got it. And perhaps the last question, it's from Alia Mubayed, who's an economist at Jefferies, and she's asking that what is likely to be the reaction of the US to a postponement of election and the continuation of the existing government in what looks like a mini military coup? Could this jeopardize the chances of continued support of a future IMF deal?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the U.S. is going to have if things continue to play out in the worst possible way, including where you get to a point where the elections are postponed, especially indefinitely. I think that the U.S. will face an important question because, up to this point, as we discussed before, it's been being very cautious. It hasn't been taking positions. It hasn't really been saying anything about what's playing out. But at the same time, this is an administration that claims that its foreign policy is driven by values-based considerations, including rights and democracy. Naturally, it's always going to be selective about that. But if the elections were to be postponed, that would be obviously an explicitly anti-democratic move. It would defy the Constitution. It would it would presumably cross all the red lines that one would expect the administration to abide by, if indeed its foreign policy is driven by this idea of the values-based, promoting rights and democracy and all. So I would think that if it came to that, at the very least, hopefully, I think this is something that should happen, U.S. officials would privately convey their concerns about that to the powers that be in Washington. But again, the imperative of being cautious and staying above the fray and not doing anything that could be perceived as the U.S. taking a side or being dragged back into domestic politics, that will remain a very strong imperative for the administration. So that's the challenge. This is another reason why the U.S., I think, wants to see things stabilize soon, because the worse things get, the more difficult it puts the United States, I think it makes it more untenable for it to just stay quiet and not say or do anything, because you don't want to get to a point where the U.S. sees things happening that defy its very that theoretically go against everything it says that it stands for in terms of its foreign policy.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael, for your time and for waking up early for this. And it was extremely insightful as always, and always a pleasure to talk to you.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. Yeah, great discussion, great questions, and always happy to join you.
Thank you. Have a great day.
All right, thanks. You too. Take care.
Bye.